When a ruthless HOA president pulled a gun on me, demanding I hand over my family's 150-year-old ranch, she had no idea who she was dealing with. Instead of giving in, I turned the tables, bought the entire HOA from under her feet, and delivered an eviction she'll never forget. The land had been in my family for over a century and a half. Nestled between the rolling hills and vast open skies, our ranch wasn't just a piece of property. It was history, heritage, and home. My great-great-grandfather had carved it out of nothing but stubborn will and hard work. Generations later, it still stood strong, though the world around it had changed in ways he probably could never have imagined. Skyscrapers now loomed in nearby cities, technology hummed everywhere, and land developers prowled like vultures, searching for the next big profit. I had left the ranch for years to build my career in finance, running my own firm in the city. But when my father passed away, I knew it was time to return and take responsibility. The ranch was more than land, it was a legacy, and the legacy needed defending. What I hadn't expected was the confrontation with the local HOA, the homeowners association that had extended its grip over the edges of our county. They weren't just neighbors managing lawn heights and trash pickup. No, this HOA was run more like a cartel. The president, a woman named Margaret Steele, had a reputation that struck fear into locals. A sharp-tongued, cold-hearted woman in her 60s, she had built a mini-empire of power, buying influence, intimidating residents, and ensuring that every decision in town ran through her. From the day I returned, I could feel her eyes on me. The ranch was surrounded by new developments, suburban-style houses with cookie-cutter lawns. The HOA had managed to extend its jurisdiction to the very edge of my property, and Margaret had bigger plans. My land was prime real estate, a developer's dream. She wanted it badly, and she made no attempt to hide it. It began with letters in the mailbox. Your fencing violates community aesthetic standards. Livestock presence causes complaints. Your barn lighting is disruptive. Each one carried the HOA's seal, though I knew well enough they had no jurisdiction over my private land. I ignored them. Then came the phone calls, then the visits from board members trying to convince me to sell. I stood firm. But Margaret didn't understand the word no. It was a warm Saturday afternoon when the situation turned violent. I was mending a section of fence near the pasture when I saw a black SUV pull up on the dirt road. Out stepped Margaret, flanked by two men who looked more like enforcers than volunteers for a neighborhood committee. She marched up, her eyes burning with arrogance. "You've had enough warnings," she said coldly. "This land doesn't belong to you anymore. It belongs to the community, and by community, I mean us." I set my tools down slowly, studying her. Last I checked, the deed says otherwise. Her lips tightened into a thin line. Then, without hesitation, she pulled a pistol from her handbag and pointed it directly at me. My stomach clenched, not from fear, but from the sheer audacity of what she was doing. One of her men shifted uneasily, but she didn't lower her aim. "You're going to sign the transfer papers," she hissed. "Either peacefully, or we'll make sure you regret every second of your stubbornness. Do you understand me?" For a long moment, silence stretched between us, only the sound of the wind whistling through the grass. I stared at her, unwavering. Then I did something she didn't expect. I laughed. The sound made her flinch. "You think this is funny?" "No," I said calmly. "I think it's pathetic. A so-called community leader pulling a gun like a thug. You're not scaring me, Margaret. You're signing your own downfall." Her face flushed with rage, and she tightened her grip on the pistol. But just then, headlights appeared down the road. A sheriff's truck rolled into view, slowing as it approached. Margaret quickly shoved the gun back into her handbag, her mask of authority snapping back in place. "Think about it," she spat before turning on her heel. "You can't win against us. The HOA owns everything around you. It's only a matter of time before we own you, too." She climbed into the SUV and sped off with her men. That night, as I sat on the porch looking out over the land, I realized the fight was no longer just about protecting my ranch. Margaret had crossed a line. She thought intimidation would break me, but all she had done was give me clarity. I wasn't going to fight her with guns or threats. No, I was going to fight her with the very thing I had mastered in the city: business. She might control the HOA, But HOAs were corporations at the end of the day, with boards, bylaws, and financial vulnerabilities. If she thought she could bully me into surrender, she had no idea who she was dealing with. I leaned back, a slow smile spreading across my face. If Margaret wanted a war, I would bring her one, not in the dirt, but in the boardroom. And by the time I was done, she wouldn't just lose the ranch she wanted, she'd lose everything. The next few days, I hardly slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Margaret's cold, venomous stare and that gun she had pulled on me in broad daylight. But what kept me awake wasn't fear, it was determination. My mind was racing with possibilities, plans, and strategies. If Margaret thought she could muscle me out, she had no clue about the kind of warfare I specialized in. I hadn't spent 2 decades building financial empires in the city for nothing. I knew corporations inside out, their bylaws, their loopholes, their weaknesses. HOAs might look like neighborhood busybodies with clipboards, but at their core they were corporations, complete with boards, officers, and most importantly, money. Money that flowed in from dues, fines, and developer partnerships. And if I knew one thing, it was that money left trails. My first step was research. I drove into town, heading straight to the county clerk's office. It didn't take long to pull up the HOA's registration documents. The Pleasant Valley Homeowners Association was a nonprofit corporation filed under the state code. I studied the board of directors, 7 members with Margaret Steele as president. I noted the bylaws and governance structure, carefully photographing everything with my phone. From there, I requested public records, budgets, financial reports, even lawsuits. What I uncovered painted a very interesting picture. Margaret had been running the HOA like her personal fiefdom. She pushed through inflated dues, slapped residents with steep fines for minor infractions, and funneled contracts to companies owned by her friends. The numbers were sloppy, too sloppy. I spotted at least 3 instances where funds seemed to vanish into administrative expenses, with no explanation. Corruption, pure and simple. That was my opening. I spent the next week networking with residents. I knocked on doors, chatted with homeowners at the grocery store, and sat at the corner booth of the local diner where gossip flowed like coffee. At first, people were wary of me. Margaret had spread plenty of rumors, but once they realized I wasn't there to sell them something, they opened up. The stories poured out. An elderly couple fined $1,500 because their paint was not the correct shade of beige. A single mother nearly forced out of her home because her kids left bicycles on the driveway. A veteran harassed over flying an American flag. Everyone had a story, and every story ended the same. Margaret crushing them under the weight of her authority. By the time I left that diner, I knew I had allies. But allies weren't enough. I needed leverage. So I dug deeper. Using my contacts in the city, I hired a forensic accountant to comb through the HOA's financial filings. Within a week, he delivered a report that nearly made me whistle out loud. Margaret had been skimming, taking consulting fees through a shell company and approving it with her rubber stamp board. Worse, she had failed to file proper disclosures with the IRS for 3 consecutive years. That wasn't just shady, that was criminal. The next step was execution. I began buying property. Quietly, discreetly, I contacted homeowners who were fed up and wanted out. Some were already planning to sell, tired of Margaret's reign. I offered fair prices, sometimes above market, and within a month I owned 5 homes inside the HOA's jurisdiction. That gave me 5 votes, 5 voices at board meetings, and 5 seats of legitimacy as a dues-paying member. When I attended my first HOA meeting, Margaret nearly choked on her arrogance. She sat at the head of the table in the community clubhouse, lips painted crimson, hair styled into a rigid helmet. When she saw me take a seat, folder in hand, her face went pale before hardening into fury. "This is a private board meeting," she snapped. "No," I said evenly. "This is an HOA meeting, and as a property owner in Pleasant Valley, I have every right to be here." Gasps rippled through the room. Residents leaned in, whispering. Margaret tried to regain control, banging her gavel. But the seed was planted. People had seen me, seen that I was unafraid of her. Over the following weeks, I pressed harder. I submitted motions, asked for transparency, demanded access to financial records that, by law, I was entitled to review. Margaret fought me at every step, screaming, dismissing, even threatening fines. But the more she resisted, the more suspicious the community became. And then came the moment I'd been waiting for. At the quarterly meeting, I stood before the crowd, holding up copies of the accountant's report. Calmly, methodically, I laid out the numbers, the missing funds, the shell companies, the fraudulent filings. I didn't accuse her outright. I let the numbers speak for themselves. Murmurs turned into outrage as residents realized what she had been doing. Margaret's face flushed crimson. She slammed her hand on the table. "This is lies, fabricated lies. He's just trying to steal from us." I leaned forward, my voice steady as steel. "If you think that, Margaret, then you won't mind if we submit these findings to the State Attorney General's office, or the IRS, or both." Silence, pure, heavy silence. She sputtered, her eyes darting between the board members. But something had shifted. For the first time, she wasn't in control. For the first time, the crowd wasn't with her. That night, she stormed out of the clubhouse, and I knew she was crumbling. But I wasn't finished, not by a long shot. Over the next month, I executed the final phase of my plan. I bought up more properties, 2 here, 3 there, until I held controlling votes. With majority ownership, I called for a special election. Margaret tried to block it, but the bylaws were clear. A majority vote could remove and replace the board. The day of the election, the clubhouse was packed wall to wall. Residents who had lived under Margaret's thumb for years showed up, hungry for change. Ballots were cast, counted, and when the results were announced, it was official. Margaret and her cronies were out. I was in. But I wasn't content just to sit in her chair. I had something else in mind, something poetic. I called an emergency board meeting, and with unanimous approval, we moved to dissolve the HOA entirely. Every bylaw, every rule, every ounce of her power vanished in a single stroke. The HOA no longer existed. And then I dropped the final hammer. The properties I had acquired, I transferred them to a trust under my control. The HOA clubhouse itself, which Margaret had treated like her throne room, was now mine. The land, the power, the authority, everything she had tried to steal from me, I now held in my hands. When the sheriff's deputy arrived at her house, 2 weeks later with an eviction notice, signed and stamped by the court, Margaret Steele finally realized the truth. She had pulled a gun on me to take my ranch. But in the end, I had taken her entire empire. The day Margaret Steele was evicted will be forever etched into my memory. Not because I enjoyed watching her lose everything, but because it was the moment justice finally outweighed intimidation. The morning was crisp, with a golden sun rising over the hills. I sat on the porch of the ranch, sipping coffee as I watched the horizon glow. For the first time in weeks, I felt calm. The papers had been signed, the court had ruled, and the sheriff was scheduled to carry out the eviction that afternoon. Margaret had burned every bridge, alienated every ally, and now the consequences had caught up to her. I drove into town just before noon, curiosity pulling me toward the scene. When I arrived at the once pristine house Margaret had lorded over, it was surrounded by a small crowd. Residents from Pleasant Valley gathered on sidewalks, some whispering, others openly grinning. It was poetic justice. They had endured her tyranny for years, and now they had front row seats to her fall. The sheriff's deputies stood firm as Margaret raged on her porch, her voice shrill with fury. Her signature red lipstick was smeared, her hair disheveled. She screamed at them, waved her arms, and accused everyone of betrayal. "You can't do this. This is my community. I built this place. You're all nothing without me," she shrieked. The deputy remained calm, reading from the document in his hand. "Mrs. Steele, the court has authorized the eviction. You are to vacate the property immediately. You no longer have ownership or legal standing here." Margaret's eyes locked on me in the crowd. The venom in her stare was almost tangible. She pointed a trembling finger. You did this. You ruined everything. You're a snake, a thief. You'll regret this day." I stepped forward, my voice steady but loud enough for everyone to hear. "No, Margaret. I didn't ruin anything. You did. You ruined yourself when you chose greed over decency, power over fairness, and fear over respect. This community isn't yours. It never was." Her face contorted, a mix of rage and desperation. For a moment, I thought she might try something reckless. But then the deputies moved in, guiding her down the steps as she kicked and cursed. Her belongings had already been moved into boxes, piled unceremoniously by the curb. The woman who once strutted like a queen now shuffled like a prisoner, her reign reduced to rubble. As the crowd watched her drive off in a dented SUV packed with whatever she could salvage, applause broke out. It wasn't wild cheering, it was relief. A weight had been lifted from their lives. I stood silently, watching her car disappear down the street. There was no satisfaction in her downfall, only closure. She had threatened my family's legacy with a gun, and in return, she had lost everything she had built through intimidation and fraud. Justice had a way of balancing the scales, though sometimes it took time and patience to see it through. In the weeks that followed, the community transformed. Without the oppressive HOA rules strangling them, residents began to breathe again. Lawns sprouted colors, flags flew proudly, and children played without fear of fines. Neighbors gathered for barbecues, helping one another with repairs and gardening. For the first time in years, Pleasant Valley truly lived up to its name. As for me, I returned to the ranch with a renewed sense of purpose. The land felt more alive than ever, rolling pastures, grazing cattle, the wide sky overhead. I spent my mornings riding fences, my afternoons working the fields, and my evenings sitting on the porch watching the sunset paint the horizon. But it wasn't just about keeping the ranch anymore. It was about legacy. My great-great-grandfather had built this place through grit and determination, and I had defended it with strategy and resilience. One day, my children and grandchildren would inherit not just the land, but the story of how it was saved. Sometimes I thought about Margaret. Rumor had it she had moved 2 towns over, living in a modest apartment. Some said she still muttered about getting back what was hers. But deep down, I knew her time was over. She had been exposed, defeated not by force, but by the very system she had tried to manipulate. On the ranch, life moved on. The seasons shifted, the cattle grew fat, and the land thrived. And every so often, when a breeze rustled the trees or the stars shone bright overhead, I thought about the strange path life had taken. A gun had been pointed at me once, and instead of cowering, I had stood tall. In the end, Margaret Steele had learned a lesson she would never forget. Power built on fear crumbles, but legacy, when defended with resolve, endures. And as I looked out over the 150-year-old ranch, standing strong against the tests of time, I knew one truth beyond doubt. This land was mine. This legacy was ours, and no one, not a woman with a gun, not an HOA, not even the march of time, would ever take it away. If you enjoyed this story of resilience, justice, and legacy, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Hidden Compass Stories. Every week, we bring you powerful tales that prove one thing. When the odds are stacked against you, standing your ground can change everything.